Good evening. Welcome, everyone, to our long-awaited airplane noise study kickoff and a cross-jurisdictional town hall discussion on aircraft noise. I am so pleased to have my Arlington County Board colleague, Matt DiFranti, here with us, and delighted to have Montgomery County Council member Andrew Friedson also here, and they're both going to help me with the program tonight, and we've got a lot of other people to help, too. You know, airplane noise has bedeviled both of our communities for a really long time, and except for the recent COVID lull, it's been getting worse, and we have reason to think that it's going to get worse yet again. And as anyone knows who has followed this issue and tried to deal with it, there are a lot of really large players involved. And if they're going to help us, we got to get them to agree to help us. And those players include the Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority, the Federal Aviation Administration, the U.S. Congress, the U.S. Secret Service, and the airline industry. So this is not an easy lift for one small or even one large county to take on, and we really all need allies in this issue. Airplane noise is truly a regional problem. We're dealing with it with not just a national airport, of course, but with Dulles and Baltimore, Washington as well, and it causes issues for our whole region. I want to give a special welcome tonight to some regional partners who I believe are joining us here. That includes Supervisor John Faust from the Fairfax County Board of Supervisors, and Council members Mary Che and Brooke Pinto from the D.C. Council in the District of Columbia. Welcome, please, the neighbors. Thank you so much for joining us. And I believe we also have Noah Simon from Congressman Don Byers' staff here with us, and we really appreciate the support we've gotten over the past several years from the congressman. So thank you all for being here, and all of our listeners for joining us. For the discussion this evening, we've got several members of our aircraft noise study team, and that includes our consultants, Jim Allardyce and Jason Schwartz from ABCX2, and they will be doing some presenting along with Emily Tranter. She's with Lockridge Grindle Nowen, and we'll also have our county staff, our very hard-working study managers, Rich Roisman from Arlington County and Ken Hartman from Montgomery County. So before we really get to the study team presentation, Andrew, Matt, and I thought we'd give you just a little brief background about how we got here. Most people on the call probably know that, but it's always good to go over it kind of quickly. So Andrew, why don't you start us off here?
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Libby. Really appreciate it. And I am thrilled to be joining tonight for this event, which is a long time coming, as you mentioned, and I know there is a long-awaited event tonight for so many who are on this call, and so many who are participating who have worked on this far longer, frankly, than I have. And I just wanted to thank and acknowledge everybody for that. Due primarily to its accessibility and central location in the region, Reagan National Airport is a preferred airport for commercial services to the region and routinely competes with BWI and Dulles for the largest share among the regional airports for regional air passengers. Noise from National Airport has been an issue for deployment of performance-based navigation, or what we always generally refer to as next-gen, in our regional airspace beginning in 2014. Since February 2016, Arlington and Montgomery County have participated in the Airport Community Working Group sponsored by the Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority as the venue for a regional discussion on aircraft noise impacts and solutions. I would like to personally thank and specifically acknowledge the Montgomery County Quiet Skies Coalition for their incredible work these past several years, learning how the FAA conducts its work, identifying potential alternative flight paths, and representing us on the working group with my colleague in county government who's with us tonight, as you heard, Ken Hartman. The working group has a North of Airport committee composed of working group members from Arlington, Montgomery, Fairfax, and the District of Columbia. Working group activities mirror those supported by the Federal Aviation Administration and those being undertaken across the United States and other metro areas seeking to address the community impacts of aircraft noise, which we know have impacted other communities as it has so significantly impacted ours. With that, Matt, why don't you go over some of the barriers we've found to getting to solutions?
Thank you, Andrew. This has been a long time coming. I'm glad to join you and our chair, Libby Garvey, as well as having convened our consultants and our experts. So as we look back and we look forward, there are some barriers. The creation of the MWA Community Working Group and the deliberations it has hosted have been helpful, but there remain a lack of data-driven understanding of what has caused the increased noise impacts and what can be done to address them. That's part of the reason for the consultants, and many jurisdictions around the region have grown frustrated with the pace and process of the working group and the perceived lack of responsiveness from MWA and the FAA as well. However, participation in the working group remains robust, and no other regional venue exists to address aircraft noise issues.
I'm muted.
The group is the only community roundtable that is officially recognized by the FAA, and so the fact remains that we do not have the data we need yet. DEC can speak for themselves, and if they're on, they certainly will, but I think that this is why the District of Columbia government commissioned its own noise study that was completed in September 2018. And I'd note that a group of residents in Northwest Washington, as well as the state of Maryland, have sued the FAA over the new DCA flight procedures. While suits can be satisfying, we all know they do not always lead to solutions. So Libby, you first reached out to Montgomery County about this study, but why don't you take it from here?
Sure. Thank you, Matt. And thank you, Andrew. Yeah, just briefly. Yeah, I reached out. It's been, we were trying to remember, it's been over 2 years because it was, pretty clear. The boards of Arlington and Montgomery County kind of knew that we had common interests here, and we weren't getting very far, particularly on the north of the airport flight paths. So we decided to fund and initiate our own joint analysis and get some related tasks through a joint procurement with a study contractor. And that, of course, all took much longer than either of us thought it would or hoped it would. We are aiming to get really a holistic approach to procedure design and reducing aircraft noise wherever we can, and sharing the impacts where necessary. As I say, it took far too long to work out all the issues between 2 legal departments, 2 purchasing departments, 2 different jurisdictions in 2 different states. But finally, we are here tonight. So let's get to the study presentation. And as a reminder to all of you joining us, you can submit questions on Facebook, the Facebook chat. Participants can also text their questions if you'd like to 571-348-3053. I'm going to put on my glasses and double check I've got that number right. 571-348-3053. And we will do our very best tonight to get to as many questions as possible. So to get to the study presentation, I'm going to turn things over to Jim Allardyce, Chief Consultant.
Libby, before you do that,
yes.
This is Jonathan Willingham. I'm Chief of Staff to Councilmember Mary Cheh in the DC Council, and I just wanted to highlight how grateful we are that you all have taken up this study. We were able to secure $500,000 in the district's budget several years ago to conduct a study which did not give us all of the answers that we wanted, and we're so interested to be here and to hear what you all have found and hoping that we will get to some solutions. So I just wanted to highlight that. So
thank you. Thank you very much, and we really appreciate you being here representing Ms. Cheh. Thank you so much. And we don't have anything quite yet. This is going to present where we're going to head out, but we look forward to working with you as we go forward. So Jim, I think I want to get your title right, if I've got it. Chief Consultant for Terminal Operations and Managing Partner of ABC X2, and you're the project manager for the study consultant team. Jim, over to you. Take it away.
Thank you. Good evening, Libby. Thank you for that. Hello, everybody. My name is Jim Allardyce. I'm going to be going through the slide presentation with you along with Jason Swartz tonight, one of my partners, and Emily Tranter, who is also partnering with us in this project. So next slide, we'll get started. ABCX2 is the project lead for this project. We're joined by Lockridge, Grinnell, and Nowlan for the community engagement piece, and Vioneer for flight procedure design and modeling. Next slide. The agenda for the slideshow is we're going to cover goals and objectives, do a project overview, talk about the schedule and milestones, review the baseline assessment so far that we've done, airspace and flight procedure design philosophies, and then we're going to have next steps, and then we'll get into a Q&A session. Next slide, please. So for the goals and objectives tonight, we're going to provide an overview of the project and the efforts to date. We're going to share key highlights from our baseline assessment. After this webinar tonight, there's going to be a questionnaire to follow seeking community input regarding what's most fair in terms of flight procedure design philosophy. This is going to be a very important part of this process, getting feedback from the community. And last but not least, provide resources for getting additional information and tracking the project as things progress. Next slide, please. So for the project overview, we'll start, and next slide. We started with a baseline assessment. This is component 1. Component 2 is airspace and flight procedure design. Component 3 is community outreach and engagement, and then component 4 is advocacy and implementation. The advocacy and implementation is with the Airport Authority and the FAA. Next slide, please. So the goal of the baseline assessment will be to understand conditions prior to and following implementation of the next-gen performance-based navigation procedures at National Airport. The analysis will include airspace and flight procedures, noise exposure, and population data. Historical analysis will include changes in flight procedures from both the Part 150 studies and environmental reviews. And next slide, please. And development of the evaluation of flight procedure alternatives, including new and or modified flight procedures to reduce community impacts. This is what Vionair is going to help us with. And they're going to be using their proprietary software to help design these procedures. We're going to try to identify an underlying design philosophy based on achieving fairness among impacted communities with input from those same communities, and evaluate notional procedures and estimate changes in noise exposure for communities within the study area. Next slide, please. My partner, Jason, is going to take over here and talk to you a little bit about, Emily is going to take over here and talk to you a little bit about community engagement.
Good evening, everyone. I wanted to just highlight the part of our study which will be making sure that we are supporting the communities and your jurisdictions by providing information about the study as it progresses, as Jim mentioned. That includes events such as this evening. And also we will be ensuring that we use our background as a firm in best practices for community engagement surrounding airport noise. And then finally, we will make sure to be consistently sharing information that we are hearing, any products that come out of this study as they are developed and presented on our website, which you can see on this slide, which is dca.nowgen.net. That will be consistently updated and have things as overviews of this slide presentation, previous and future slide presentations, and also tools like a glossary of terms for acronyms, as we know that in this world acronyms can rule, and it's easy to not kind of follow them. So we'll have those up for you so that you can track and use as a resource. So thank you. I think that's it. Next slide.
Component 4 is to engage directly with the FAA and advocate for acceptance and supporting of implementation of proposed solutions to reduce community noise impacts. This is an extremely important part of the process. One of the things that we've been able to arrange is direct communication with the people that are responsible for the airspace and the design of the local procedures. So having a dialogue with them to, get the background from their perspective, and also be able to find out what they can and cannot do and evaluate that from our perspective and our past experience is just invaluable to this project, I think, moving forward. We also want to support the work of the DCA Community Working Group and North of Airport Committee. It's going to be those people primarily that are going to give us the feedback that we need to move this project forward, as well as all the input that we're going to get this evening. So next slide, please. So this is a timeline of the project, what we've done so far. We started the project back in April, and shortly thereafter, we began the baseline assessment. The baseline assessment is intended to gather the information that you guys already know. It's for our edification, and then if we find anything that you may not know, that will become part of the baseline report that we will do, which should be out pretty close to the end of this month. Tonight is the kickoff meeting. After the kickoff meeting, we're going to get your input, and that will go into the decision-making process of an ultimate design philosophy. That will lead to the airspace and procedure design, which we anticipate to be in full swing by late October, to be completed by the end of January, at which time we'll have another one of these community conversations to bring back to you all what we have come up with as notional procedures for you all to take a look at. If you have feedback at that meeting that causes us to make changes to the design, we will go back, do that, and have yet another meeting if it is necessary. Any airspace and procedure design modifications that have to be done based on criteria, community feedback, and so forth should be accomplished first quarter of next year. After that, we're going to have the advocacy and implementation support, so that when we take this forward through the community working group to the airport and to the FAA, we can shepherd it through the process to get the agreed upon notional procedures actually in the publication process, so that you actually have a physical, something to touch, see, smell, hold on to. There's actually going to be a change. So next slide, please. Jason is going to take over from here and tell you what he's done thus far in the baseline assessment. Jason?
Thanks, Jim. So as Jim mentioned, the initial component, or one of the initial components of the project.
Either you're muted or...
Can you hear me now?
It's a little quiet.
Great. You want to take this, Jim, while I try to figure out what's going on?
I can hear you, it's just very quiet.
This chart basically speaks for itself.
Yeah. Jim, do you want to, maybe you should narrate for a while until Jason gets his sound
Yeah,
on.
we can do that. So the first part of the baseline assessment, one of the things that Jason did for us was go back and take a look at noise complaints. This chart tells you basically from 2013 to 2019 where they started, and that they follow along with, well, actually what they don't do is they don't actually follow along with just the volume of traffic. So what this chart tells us is that there was actually an increase in complaints due to procedure changes, not just volume of traffic related. Next slide, please. This is the chart of the volume of traffic. We did have a little dip in 2014. There were several things that went on that year that caused a drop in traffic, but pretty much the traffic has been consistent. So this reinforces what I just said about the noise complaints being independent of actual volume increases in traffic. Next slide. In the baseline assessment, one of the recurring themes has been the use of the Potomac River corridor has been prioritized since the 1960s when jet service began at DCA. And the initial Part 150 noise compatibility study was conducted in 1989. And in 2004, Part 150 reinforced the use of Potomac River and encouraged the use of advanced navigation to improve precision along the center of the river. So this has been a recurring theme for many, many years. Jason, you want to try again? I see the mute still on, but see if you can unmute and try again.
Okay, is it any better now?
Yeah, it's a little better.
Okay, so yeah, as Jim was saying, looking back historically, we find that since the 1960s, the tendency has been to try to maximize overflight of the Potomac River as a way to keep overflights and subsequent aircraft noise away from those denser populations, dense residential areas.
Can you all hear him now?
Unfortunately not. It was good, and then I think there's some kind of connection that goes in and out.
All right, well, I'll keep going. And
sorry,
maybe
Jason.
maybe you can try a dial in, and that might help. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we're looking at in the baseline assessment is land usage. To take a look at not just where the residential uses are, but where the other land uses are that could give us an opportunity to put airplanes over specific places where the noise would be more compatible. In other words, we would have to take a look at, parks and golf courses and, residential areas, commercial areas, those kinds of things. So we're going to be looking at that in the area, the entire study area. This is the best map we could get right now. We're looking for better maps to expand up more to the northwest so we can see better land uses going to the northwest. Next slide, please. The other thing about the historic flight patterns that we noticed in this, on the left, you'll see departures coming out of the airport in those blue shaded areas. Some of the departures take off and turn to the west. Some of those are smaller aircraft. Some of them were not. This is historic departures. But what it does illustrate is that most of the aircraft tended to stay along the river corridor going out to the northwest. Additionally, on the reverse side, coming in from the northwest on the arrivals, which is the chart on the right side, again, they tend to stay over the river. And that's something that, like Jason said, is a recurring theme that has happened since back in the 1960s. Next slide, please. So this is historic track density. The flight track density in 2014, what that shows is that this is arrivals coming in on the slide on the left, and it shows the tracks are much more diffuse back in 2014. You can see the different colors. The closer it gets to the yellow and red, the higher density of traffic that you get. The closer it gets more to the purple and brown, the lower density of the traffic that you get. This shows aircraft being vectored in from the downwinds and then turn to the final on various different approaches. There's a little sliver of a blue line to the southwest. That's the old RMP approach. Could be also part of the old RNAV visual approach as well. The one on the right, as you can see, the 2017 map, all those tracks are much more concentrated. And that's the quote unquote channelization that y'all have been talking about for quite some time. It's very easy to see in these two slides. Next slide, please. This is just more of a close-up view of what you just saw. Some of the tracks in close to the airport are an RNAV approach to runway 15. That's that blue line that goes over Arlington Cemetery. Then the rest of the stuff you can see is channelized along the river, and you can see the difference in track density between 2014 and 2017, how in 2017, everything is much narrower. So then the next slide, you can go to next slide, you can go to flight procedures. Now I'm getting back into my area of expertise, so I'll be more comfortable during this part. This is the river visual approach. This is the current version. As you all know very well, there was an older version that started further west along the river, but it also had a shortcut where aircraft could be more to the west, more like over the CIA and down to what the current CTOC intersection is. And then the aircraft would intercept the river and then fly on in on the river visual approach. Whereas today, the star, like you've heard of the Freedom and the Troops stars that come in from the west, they all come up over the Fergie intersection. And that's where you get that channelization up there from Fergie to Derrick, even on this visual approach. Next slide, please. The long-standing LDA to runway 19 was renamed the LDA Yankee to runway 19. LDA stands for Localizer Type Directional Aid. There's actually a localizer on the airport that points out to the northwest that has been used for navigation for decades. Next slide, please. Then the next one that they did was they added the LDA Zulu. The LDA Zulu was added because it has lower minimums. You can get into the airport on the LDA Yankee with about a 700-foot overcast, whereas with the LDA Zulu you can get down more close to 500 feet overcast. So the reason that they wanted to do that was it gives a higher access rate to the airport. Next slide, please. The first RNP was built about 2005-ish timeframe and implemented. This was implemented with very little or no input from Potomac Tracon at the time. The airlines did this and the FAA did this as basically a test procedure. It was used, but not extremely as much as the one currently. But this is the old one. The new one, go ahead, next slide, please. The new one moved up to the northeast, and that is when they really started to use this procedure quite a bit more. That's the green line that goes in there. They also moved the Fergie intersection a mile to the northwest. So there was a much longer segment between Fergie and Derrick, which is used for, as we said before, the RNAV, the river visual approach, as well as the RNAV approach. And the other aircraft that are coming into the LDA Zulu also go to Fergie, and then they can transition to that approach as well. So there's quite a bit of traffic over that segment there. Next slide, please. So transitioning to the departure side, the original performance-based navigation departure at DCA was the laser departure. This attempted to leverage the area navigation, RNAV capabilities of aircraft to stay along the river corridor and proceed out to the northwest. It also gives them a higher level of probability of missing the prohibited area, P56 alpha. That was a big concern, still is a big concern to the FAA. Next slide, please. The Holt B departure came in recently as a test procedure. One of the things that we found out about this procedure is it was purposefully decided that they would use this route because it is one of the least used routes at the airport for the test procedure. They could take a lot of the aircraft that went on it, specifically take a look at their performance to make sure that they could make the turns and that the segment lengths were appropriate so that the airplanes could actually fly it. The downside to that means that we really have not had an opportunity to fully test and understand the impact of the noise that all the procedures will cause once they're transitioned over to this flight path. Currently, it's on the books for December 31st of this year. However, we believe that time frame may slip due to COVID and other things that are going on right now. So we're just going to be looking forward to having the opportunity to run this through our software so that we can truly test the impact of the noise difference between the laser flight path, which all the rest of the SIDS currently are flying, and the Holt B, which is the proposed new flight path that they will transition to. Next slide, please. This is a zoom in of one of the major changes on the Holt B, where they moved the flight path from over the ADAX intersection, which was actually over the river, to on land, the RevG intersection. Again, this is one of the areas that we want to take a look at in the procedure modeling and design phase to find out what the impact is and where we can actually put the procedure that it will have the least amount of noise impact to people on both sides of the river there. Next slide, please. So the green line that you see here is the National 7. The National 7 was the old flight procedure, the original flight procedure that aircraft flew when they departed the airport. What they did was they took off and they made an immediate left turn to the northwest to miss the prohibited area. And then they continued the left turn to join that green line and then fly out to the northwest. Up there towards the end of the green line, the aircraft were vectored to their next fix. That gave dispersion of air traffic, and those aircraft on vectors went to all points. So what they experienced back then was a much more diffuse flight pattern than we have today with the RNAV departures. Next slide, please. So let's see if Jason is back, because this would be his slide. Can you test your volume again, Jason?
Yeah, is it working now, I hope?
Much better.
Okay, sorry about that. I turned off the camera. It seems like it's interfering somehow with the audio. Okay, so a major goal or objective of our conversation tonight is really focusing on finding out what the community as a whole feels is a fair approach to procedure design. So as you heard, and as we understand that over the history since the 60s, there have been a number of flight procedure changes, new flights being put, or flight procedures published, modifications to those. And in some cases, they've been beneficial, and in others, they've had sort of drawbacks. So what we're trying to find out is, as an underlying design philosophy, what does the community think would be most fair in terms of how should these procedures be designed relative to the actual flight paths on the ground and therefore the noise exposure. So in some of the earlier conversations we've had with the community working group and the North of Airport, the committee and the working group, we've gotten some initial input. We wanted to discuss those and then expand this list, hopefully. So the first sort of concept here is continuing to center flights along the Potomac River. This is referred to historically around DCA as maximizing time over water. Again, that is sometimes beneficial because it keeps the aircraft over or away from those higher density locations on either side of the Potomac. We can also look at flight paths based on land use. So in general terms, do you feel as though it's more fair to put the flight paths over non-noise sensitive areas such as industrial areas, commercial areas, again, the Potomac River, versus what you as a community consider noise sensitive, which in most cases are residential, but other communities might be looking at green space or parks. Sometimes communities see those as noise sensitive, schools, places of worship, etc. So we'll be looking at land uses, or potentially as one way to design these procedures. If we do look at land use, or if that's the recommendation from the community, then we'll want input also on how the community feels land uses should be prioritized. So as I mentioned, residential is kind of recognized, I think, around the globe as the premier noise sensitive land use. But then there's also schools, parks, places of worship. Those locations may be also considered noise sensitive in some communities, less so in others, as far as where procedures should be designed. So we'll be looking for input on what types of land uses would be considered noise sensitive and which ones would not be for the DC metro area. Flight paths can be based on population density. So if that were the philosophy that was recommended by the community, that might mean trying to focus the majority of the overflights over higher density areas. So if you can't avoid residential, or you're flying over the Potomac and there's residential development on both sides, would you recommend favoring the higher density, or avoiding, the higher density residential areas and moving the noise and the overflights over the more sparsely dense, sparse density population areas? What we've seen in some communities, that might be like farmland, things like that, where you just have less people per square mile or acre. Flight paths should be consistent with historical conditions. That was something that we've heard, whereby after looking at those other options, making it consistent with what's been the sort of the historical flight procedure design. And that way, folks that have lived here for a while and made choices on where they're going to move based on those procedures, there's some consideration there, so as to not change things too drastically where possible. And then there's the question of flight paths and concentration of noise. And as many of you know, NextGen, often it's called performance-based navigation. These are technologies that improve precision, whereby you can do a better job concentrating aircraft over their intended flight path. In this case, it could be the Potomac River. But that precision does cause concentration. So the same communities, for example, those close to the shoreline of the river, are going to be getting a lot more traffic, because that traffic, which used to be sort of dispersed over a wider area, is now finally concentrated as we see improved precision by the navigational technologies that are available. So input on concentration versus dispersion is something that we'd be interested in hearing about. And then finally, we discussed a concept of combining or prioritizing multiple philosophies. So using sort of a prioritized metric, or whereby you might say, first try to get it over the river, and then in areas that you can't actually over the water, then look at these other metrics. So, where it can't be over the water due to a curve or because the river is too narrow, then look at look at the land uses, or look at the population densities, things like that, to help us decide how that procedure should be developed. Those are just some of the ideas that we've come up with as a team, and some of the feedback that we've heard through the survey and comments following the conversation today. We're looking for other approaches that the community feels should be considered, and that would encourage fairness among all the impacted communities in terms of the procedure design philosophy overall. With that, I will turn it over to Emily to talk about how we're going to collect community input.
Thanks, Jason. Yes, so to date, as you can see, we've received input as a team from North of Airport Committee in July, also the DCA Community Working Group, which is comprised of several communities. This kickoff meeting this evening, and then it will be followed by the community questionnaire, which will be available online. And the procedure design philosophy will be selected based on this input that we received from the community groups and from the community at large who participate in this questionnaire. And next slide.
Good Good evening, everyone. I'm Ken Hartman. I'm the chair of the North of Airport Committee for the Community Working Group. I just want to take a moment and just acknowledge that it's been a challenge working on this working group over the last 4 to 5 years. We must be the only working group around the country who has not had a technical expert working alongside of us. And so I'm very thrilled to be working with ABCX2 and the communities north of the airport. And I want to thank everyone, especially elected officials, who helped make this possible. So the North of Airport Committee met on July 22nd to have a very similar discussion to what we're having tonight about a philosophy for procedure design. Our initial discussion focused around a priority and then a hierarchy of considerations that draw from that. The priority that we discussed was to design flight paths over areas that have the least impact on people. And these are areas such as portions of the Potomac River, places where people don't live, and commercial and industrial areas. There are large properties such as the Central Intelligence Agency and in Montgomery County, the Naval Surface Warfare Center. That could be possibilities. And then from there, where these residential and noise-sensitive areas could not be avoided, to design flight procedures to share the noise burden. And the first consideration we had following this priority was to design flight procedures that limit the exposure so no one area, no one neighborhood isn't unfairly burdened with the entire region's worth of flights. Next slide, please. The next consideration was to design flight procedures that minimize noise exposure to the communities that are exposed to the highest noise levels. And there are techniques that we've discussed with ABCX2, such as straight line climb outs and minimizing turning aircraft. The closer to the runway, variability may not be feasible, although there are options we've discussed with Jim and his team. But our desire is for those who are impacted by noise to seek ways to minimize that impact. The next consideration is to design flight procedures that avoid heavily populated areas. And then finally, the last consideration was where there are no compatible areas or where variability is not feasible and where population density isn't a decision point, to consider the historical flight tracks before 2015 in recognition of the fact that these had been in existence for a long time with very minimal levels of complaints, as evidenced in that earlier slide in our presentation. But again, thank you for presenting this. We look forward to the feedback tonight as the committee refines its priorities for Jim and his team. Thank you.
You're on mute, Jim.
Would help if I unmuted. The community questionnaire will be live August 21st. That's tentative date through September 21st. We want to give at least 30 days to get your feedback on the design philosophies that we're going to use. Results will be reviewed during the DCA Community Working Group meeting in October. As we stated before, this is the officially sanctioned group by the FAA to give input to the FAA. So ultimately, all the feedback from everybody is going back to that working group for compilation and the final decision as what the design philosophy will be. Once that final design philosophy and priorities are selected, we'll move into the component 2 procedure design portion. Part of component 2 is already underway, which is baselining and modeling of existing procedures so that when we can come up with the new notional procedures, we have something to compare and show you at our next community conversation which will be held, as we said, sometime in the February 2021 timeframe. That's where we're going to review the notional procedures and give you an opportunity yet again to give us feedback on those before we move forward with anything. Next slide, please. So for more information, as Emily said, this is our website, dca.nowgen.net. Nowgen is just a conglomeration of ABCX2, Lockridge, Grindle, Nowen, Vionair, and one other company that is not involved in this project, but all of us together bring the expertise that we believe is going to help you all actually see some meaningful and measurable results. And throughout the rest of the project, not only during the survey piece, or the questionnaire period, but throughout the entire project, if you have any narrative comments that you would like to forward to us, please email noise2020@arlingtonva.us. You can email anytime to that address and we'll take your feedback. The one thing that it will be very useful for is if you're taking the questionnaire and you don't see something addressed in that questionnaire that you want to give us feedback on, go to this email address and give us that feedback. All right, that's it for us. Back to you, Miss Libby.
Great. Thank you so much, Jim. This is great. Thank you, Jim, Jason, Ken, Emily. It's wonderful to have you pulling this together for us. I just felt, we've been so handicapped not having this kind of expertise and concentrated help. This is really good. So the same person who's been, Rich Roisman, who's been handling the slides and things, is also kind of handling the questions. So he's going to kind of pull some of the ones together. I'm assuming they're coming in. And I'll just start off with one for, I don't know who would be best to answer this one, basically, GAO. So I got interviewed by some folks from GAO. I suspect a lot of people here did, including some folks attending. What's up with that? They're doing some kind of study. Does anybody know what's going on with that? And of course, would it have any intersection with what we're doing?
Jim, do you
Emily,
want me to
take that one?
Yeah, absolutely. So I know that in the last FAA bill that was passed in 2018 by Congress, there were several studies that were directed to different agencies or advisory groups, to the FAA or research bodies, and one of those was the GAO, to do a research project and see the community outreach metrics, or study how much community outreach there was in relation to NextGen, in relation to performance-based navigation. So my understanding of the study, and I was interviewed as well, is that it was much more broad. It was nationwide. And I know that there is going to be several airports included, but it was not specific to this area, to DCA, to the Washington metropolitan region. So this is different than our study in that we are specifically focusing on airplane noise, air traffic at this airport, not in a national study of kind of what community engagement has looked like from the FAA in general as NextGen has moved forward and performance-based navigation, those channeling of flights, has rolled out.
Okay, thank you. So they're doing more. What I'm hearing you say is community engagement, and that's just such a tiny piece of all of the noise and what's causing the noise. Yeah, there hasn't been much here. I could just let it go at that. So it's fine. Matt, Andrew, any questions that you would like to ask right now before I go, and we'll see if we've got some other ones.
Not immediately. I do think we'll get to the ones in the chat.
Yeah, so someone has asked something about in the later afternoon between 5 and 8 p.m. There seem to be more arrivals, is what somebody I think has asked about. Let me see if there's a little more. I've got to just scroll on my screen to try and see what happens. Yeah, so somebody's asked, there seem to be more arrivals than departures between 5 and 8 p.m. Is it possible for the default setting for arrivals at that time to be from the south rather than the north? Weather permitting, of course. Arrivals from the south, of course, go over open water, and they're much less disruptive for people here. So I don't know if that's a Jim question or who, but
yeah, I'll take it. Sure. Anything's possible. I think for many, many reasons that a north operation, in other words, arrivals from the south, departures to the north, is preferable for the airspace. We had some feedback from the TRACON that, gives us a picture of the airspace, and there's a lot more airspace to the south of the airport, and aircraft that need to be vectored to the final approach course. They got like 30 miles of airspace to the south, where they only got 17 to 20 miles to the northwest of the airport. So they prefer being on a north operation for arrivals anyway. So if that holds true, I think they said about 60 to 70% of the time they're actually on a north operation is the feedback that we've got. So.
Okay. Yep. And somebody's asked, so this is important because some people are not clear on what is the P56A and the P56B areas. What are those? Go ahead.
So there's different types of airspace and different levels of restriction. The highest level of restriction is the P airspace, or prohibited airspace. The prohibited airspace 56 Alpha is the White House, the Capitol building, all the government buildings along the mall. That is in P56 Alpha, prohibited area 56 Alpha. Prohibited area 56 Bravo is out at the Vice President's house. That's what that one is. The one that is most pertinent to DCA is P56 Alpha. That lies within the closest proximity to the airport. And that's why the airplanes have to make such a sharp turn to the west when they take off, so that they can avoid that airspace.
Jim, would you talk a little bit about what happens if a pilot goes into that airspace by mistake?
Well, right now, basically what happens is they record the flights that go in there. Domestic flights that go in there, it's euphemistically called a blunder. They blunder into that airspace. Normally, they're fined pretty heavily for transiting that airspace. In other heightened alert times, they would send aircraft to intercept them. I'd hate to think we ever get to the place where they actually try to shoot somebody down for flying in there. But it really literally could get to that if you have that much of a heightened level of security. That is the most restricted airspace in the United States.
Okay. And there's some pretty, I think, severe, penalties for the pilots, which is why they would rather
Absolutely.
make it we're on our side.
Yeah,
so
the pilots can be suspended for 30 days or more for doing that.
Yeah. So it's pretty draconian. We got another question in the chat, but I will say, Andrew, if you got something that you would like to ask, I want to just make sure that you guys, maybe wave at me if you've got something. Andrew, anything?
Sure. Maybe, Jim, could you describe the different sets of changes made to the flight path north of the airport? In other words, my understanding and some of the residents is it's not just about the next gen changes. There have been other changes as well, and maybe you could just describe that a bit to those who are listening in.
You mean what precipitated some of the changes?
Yeah, and just what they are, just a broad overview, because, some of it we focus on is the next gen changes, but there have been other flight path changes as well when we talk about returning to historical.
Sure. Well, I tell you what, Jason's done the baseline, and he's looked back at a lot of the reasoning for that. So if Jason, you want to talk about that?
Sure. Can you hear me this time?
We can. We can't see you, but we can hear you.
Okay. Yeah. So I look at it from an airport and a noise perspective. I'm not an air traffic person. But what I've noticed going historically is, again, starting in the 60s, there was a shift when jet service at DCA started up. The noise was significantly higher, of course, than the previous generation of aircraft. So the concept of moving it over the Potomac sort of came about at that point. And then most of the shifts that I've seen came from, for example, noise compatibility studies that were conducted by the airport. That's a process that is regulated by the Federal Aviation Administration. It's a way for airports to measure the noise that exists at the airport, and then identify solutions such as flight procedure changes. Sound insulation is sometimes a outcome of a Part 150 study. But anyway, it's a program that the airport can take on voluntarily. And if you do so, the recommendations or some of the recommendations that come out of that study can be eligible for federal funding. So through the Part 150 studies, and I've looked at two, I believe DCA has only, thus far anyway, has conducted two. Both of those refer to pushing aircraft more or improving the precision with which aircraft overfly the Potomac. So there's been the changes related to noise preceding the next gen changes. But what the next gen changes did, from what I've seen, is improved or brought in the newer technology, right? So the RNAV, this is Jim's area, but the RMP, the higher precision technologies, and those were in part as part of the next gen project, but that was preceded again through the Part 150, which the Part 150 studies are all about improving noise exposure in the area. So without getting too technical, but to give you a couple examples, the Part 150s, which would have been driven by a community, or at least had involvement from a community working group, that the recommendations that came out of that group included using satellite navigation, I think they called it, or advanced navigation, to improve the precision with which aircraft fly over the river. So in response to those requests, I believe flight procedures were modified and changed. The problem was, if you're looking at a procedure that's maybe west of the river and you push it closer to the river, then obviously you're getting closer to the communities on the east side. Similarly, when they tried to improve the time over water, they did that from a distance from, like, say, Waypoint Fergie to the end of the runway. So they were looking at it holistically, and over that entire distance, were they able to, their goal was probably increase time over water. And so those few times where they diverged from the river and they were over, say, Washington, D.C. because of a tight turn in the river or a narrowing, that's what happened. So the net result was more time over the river than the previous procedure, but for some communities, they saw an increase in noise, which sort of resulted in more pushback against the FAA and then more changes to try to fix the issues that had come up. So that's why we're trying to look at a more holistic approach and this fairness philosophy, so that we can look at it from Fergie or beyond all the way to the runway and back. All along, not just sort of an overall time over river metric, which could leave some people with more noise than they're previously experiencing.
Good. Thank you. So there's Matt, I see there's a good question in here that I think's got a political answer as well. Is that where you're headed, Matt? Go ahead.
Yes.
Yeah, ask it. Go ahead.
So there's a question about, does the Reagan Airport or FAA have any obligation to adhere to the proposals from the study?
Let me take that, Jim.
I can. From the standpoint of the working group, they have an obligation to consider what is put forth in the working group. They don't have an obligation to do it. But that's why you guys hired us, was because when we put forth the proposals, they should be more likely to accept them, because we will have considered input from you all, input from the FAA criteria in procedure design, noise impact, the whole 9 yards. What we're doing tonight is kind of part of their job. We're doing the community engagement piece tonight with you all, and over the next several months getting feedback from you. So once all this goes through to that working group, we have the design philosophy and we have the notional procedure designs that we want to take forward. Those procedure designs, what we believe, and our philosophy has always been, is that we present a win-win philosophy. We have to take into consideration the FAA's needs as well as the community's needs, and that's the only way that you're going to get anything put through that group implemented.
Yeah, Jim, if I could just chime in, it relates to the previous answer too. I think there's a feeling among many communities that they weren't involved or consulted in many of the changes that took place, which has helped to lead us to the situation that we're currently in. It's my hope, and I think part of the reason why I'm excited for this long-awaited moment that we're now in, for us to be able to move forward in a way that actually does incorporate significant amounts of community engagement and involvement, and recognizing the fact that we can't solve it if we don't have a solution that is fair, that respects the historical nature of things, that is reasonable, that everybody feels like takes into consideration their communities. And so hopefully your expertise will help us to get there, because I think that's the only chance we have to actually arrive at a solution, is one where there's broad-based buy-in from communities across the region.
Yep. And they're elected officials, which helps. And we're really glad we've got, again, as Congressman Beyer and some of the, all different levels of government here. Matt, I'll let you finish. I mean, to me, looking at this, I think the short answer is, do they have any obligation to adhere to the proposals? No, but we're going to make it really hard for them not to. And in the court of public opinion, hopefully, do what we need to do. But it's really great. I mean, you haven't quite said it, Jim, but it has felt to me all the way along. The reason we're doing this, and Montgomery County and Arlington got together, is the FAA and the feds were not doing their job. They weren't doing the community engagement. They weren't doing the analysis. They weren't providing. So we're doing that. And I'm glad we've got you here. Matt, did you want to add something more?
Well, I see there's one more question in the chat, but I just have one that's related to this, which is, you mentioned in your presentation, Jim, that there's a number of factors that Holt B may be delayed beyond December 31st. I'm not asking you to commit on that, but I would think that even with your experience engaging with the FAA during COVID may be more difficult. And is it fair to say that there's a chance that part of the reason for that potential delay is that it's difficult to engage in the discussions and work towards the win-win that your company seeks to pursue? Is that part of the reason that there may be a delay?
Oh, absolutely. I think that has a lot to do with it. The FAA was not available to engage with the working group for at least a couple of meetings, if not more. And one of the things that we had hoped was that starting back in April, that I was going to be able to have one-on-one conversations with the folks out at the TRACON, and that has not happened. So the only time that I've been able to talk to them since was just a brief conversation with one of the folks from the TRACON on Friday. So that's the first time I've been actually able to directly engage with them. And of course, I don't want to ask for the moon the very first time we talked, but we did get some good dialogue started. And I think that moving forward, they're anxious to get working with us. I think they really, really do want to work with us on this project. So I was very encouraged.
Well, that's great to hear. Yep, go ahead, Libby.
Would you talk a little bit about, would you elaborate a little bit about what TRACON means? Who and what are TRACON?
Sorry.
I know what you're saying.
Yeah,
but
well, yeah, I live in acronym hell. I'm sure that you guys do as well, but TRACON is Terminal Radar Approach Control. I worked in Atlanta TRACON, the Terminal Radar Approach Control. It's the FAA entity that controls roughly within about 30 or 40 miles of the primary airport, and roughly 10 to 15,000 feet down to the surface. They are primarily responsible for the separation of aircraft proceeding to and from the airport. Most everybody, when they think of air traffic control, they think of a control tower, and that control tower is responsible for the immediate airport. But there's two other layers of air traffic controllers. One is TRACON, the other is what we call the Air Route Traffic Control Center. And those are responsible for high altitude en route traffic, but they feed the aircraft into the TRACON for arrivals, and the TRACON feeds the departures out to the center It's a whole thing. You're never, ever not in communication with an air traffic controller from the time you leave your gate to the time you park at your gate at the other end. And
that's a good thing. So we've got a question here, which I think I heard the answer, which I think is yes, but I think elaborate. I think it was in Jason's presentation. I think I may not have heard it correctly. Will there be any work done to investigate different climb rates and takeoff procedures for departures?
So the background on this is very broad. Yes, there will. Within limits. So those limits are the performance of the aircraft and the laws and the rules. And I'll talk about aircraft performance and I'll give Jason the laws and rules part. But from a performance standpoint, I was involved with a project up at Boston that was kicked off based on an MIT study. And one of the portions of that had to do with the noise generated by aircraft on climb out and what airspeed would be the best for aircraft to climb out at. They came up with a figure of 220 knots with the aircraft in clean configuration. In other words, the gear was up, the flaps were up, and then so it basically eliminated the airframe noise, which is almost, believe it or not, as loud as engine noise. And that gave the least amount of noise impact to the ground, according to the study. However, the pilots in that working group up there all objected to it because the aircraft in that configuration had such a small envelope of safety. In other words, they're perfectly capable of climbing out at 220 knots, but they usually do it with flaps set. And that gives them a bigger margin of safety in case of wind gusts, wind shear, whatever else, some other, anomaly that happens. For them to climb out with flaps up, according to that study, they felt that the margin of safety was unacceptable. So I will say that the position of pilots have been to use one of two noise abatement departure procedures that are standard across the United States. We will take into consideration those two and determine which one of those is best applied here. But as far as a one-off or a special departure procedure for DCA, that's where Jason comes in and he'll explain to you probably why that won't happen.
Okay. Jason, do you want to explain that?
Sure. He kind of threw me the potato, didn't he? So there's a lot of regulation and legislation, most of which you've probably heard about, including the Airport Noise and Capacity Act, which really limited what airports can and can't do in terms of mitigating noise. So, the short answer is it's possible to get customized profiles like that done. A lot of people in our work mentioned to us the John Wayne Airport departure procedure, where they kind of blast off like a rocket right off the runway. And then once they hit the perimeter of the airport and they're over residential communities, they slow down, nose down, and they're kind of quieter until they reach the ocean, the Pacific Ocean, and then they blast off again. Procedures like that are much less common now because the fleet is so much quieter than it's been, and the FAA and the airlines really are trying to keep everything as standardized as possible. There's a safety issue or safety sort of risk when you start having specialized departure procedures for each airport. So regulatorily, it's something that we could look at, but in all likelihood, it's not something that would be accepted. And so we tend to try to focus our effort and resources on things that we think will make a difference for y'all on the ground. Somebody asked about preferring a south flow versus a north flow. That's the kind of thing that, as Jim said, that's weather dependent and there's other factors, but that's something that could be done potentially with the airport and with air traffic willingness to explore. But an actual departure profile and how the aircraft engines are set and all that when departing, that's usually not something that will be approved through FAA. So it's probably not something we would pursue.
All right. So we had a question about helicopter flight paths and frequency. Is that being looked at? And I'm pretty sure the answer is no, because we would have liked to have done that, but we had limited resources. And I do know our Congressman Don Beyer has been doing a lot in this area, so would encourage folks to contact him, and we're trying to be supportive and work with his office on helicopter noise. But I'm pretty sure helicopter noise isn't going, and frequency is not going to factor in, but maybe it does somehow. Jim, Jason?
The helicopter flight paths, noise, and stuff like that is not part of the scope of this project.
Yeah, we just didn't have the resources to do that, so we're gonna fight on.
I would just note, Congressman Raskin on our side of the river as well has been very much engaged in this issue. Definitely something that we hear a lot from residents. I know you all do as well. It's a considerable issue, but I think a separate issue as well that we're all very concerned about and working with our federal partners on.
And if I can add to that,
go ahead, Ken.
Being the community work group for National Airport, very early on, the ground rules were no helicopters. So that was set by the Airports Authority. They don't do helicopters, so it's outside of our purview in this working group.
Okay, great.
Thanks, Ken.
Yep. And then we've got a question which I know has come up. I'm not sure who should answer this one. Maybe a historian, some history background. Has anyone ever questioned whether there should even be such a busy airport in such a densely populated airport and so close to the White House, the Pentagon, and other strategic places? I remember a lot of intense discussion back around 9/11, but I think it's maybe come up before. Anybody want to take that one at all?
Jason or Emily?
I mean, I could say that sort of one of the questions about scope and whether we have whether this is a focus for us. It's not really a question. We kind of go in assuming the airport's going to exist.
Yeah.
With the FAA, with the federal government owning and operating the airport, I'm not sure it's. I mean, it's a question for somebody, but probably not our particular team.
I think I went over kind of the challenges we have addressing the noise of this airport. I think if you were addressing the existence of the airport, that would be magnified many different times. I don't know, Matt or Andrew, anything you want to add to that?
That is well beyond my jurisdiction in more ways than one.
Well, it also seems a little, the expertise that you bring and the win-win approach that you described. We might wish we were in a different reality, but it seems like this is working on getting the right route that's going to help as many of our residents on both sides of the river seems better to me.
Yeah. I think the answer to the question, yes, people have questioned that over time. That's not within our scope right now. We're moving forward, assuming the airport is going to be there. And then someone asked about the presentation slides being available online, and I'm pretty darn sure they might be at the website. Maybe that's an Emily question.
Yes, they absolutely will be on the dca.nowgen.net website. We will get those up first thing tomorrow morning, so those will be accessible. There's a available documents section that it will be under.
Yep. Great, thank you. And then we've got a question, can more quiet engines or baffles or slower airspeeds or something to be used to make the engines quieter? And I'll add a little bit. I assume that over time airplanes are getting quieter, that's something that they're looking at, but maybe not. Maybe that's a Jim question, I'm not sure.
That's a Jason question.
All right, Jason.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, you're correct. The aircraft are getting quieter. It's hard to say that they're quiet. I understand that for folks on the ground, especially close in and underneath these flight paths, it's extremely loud. But if you were to look at And this actually, part of this will be in the baseline report that we do. We'll be looking at the aircraft fleets and how the noise level for each of the aircraft and aircraft types that were operating in DC, say back in the 2010, 2012 timeframe versus today. The aircraft are significantly quieter than they were. Having said that, we understand that they can be very loud and annoying for folks. There's no like special baffles or mufflers, nothing like that. These are all, the aircraft are certified by the FAA. There's only a handful of manufacturers that create them, and really the aircraft themselves are all standardized. So if you see one airline, a 737-900 from one carrier, they're going to have mostly the same equipment in terms of engine and noise and such. There's no special stuff that can be put on these airplanes to make them quieter.
Are the newer ones getting quieter?
Absolutely. Yeah. If you were to look at the old, the aircraft are broken down by noise into stage 1 through 5. So the stage 1 were the 707s and the really early jets. And I don't have a number in terms of percentage, how much louder they were percentage wise, but in the baseline report, we'll put some comparisons so folks can see, at least on paper, the difference in the noise exposure levels for an older jet versus what's flying today.
That would be great. Thank you. And then we've got a question. Actually, this is a version of a question I was going to ask, which is, let me get it down. So this person says, this seems like a very two-dimensional analysis. It seems like it'd be much more robust if we could include examination of times of day, altitude, speed, engine noise technology. Can those considerations be added at this point, or is it too late? And I will add, it had seemed to me that time of day, when we're talking about fairness and distributing, that time of day would be, and actually when you should fly where, that would actually be significant. So I'm assuming you're at least looking at that. Who's that?
Yeah,
Who takes
we
that?
will be looking at that as well. And the other piece of the modeling that we're going to do, that is component 2. Is the modeling of the existing procedures and then help inform us on what we need to do on the new procedures going forward. The proprietary software that Veoneer brings is multidimensional. It takes into consideration, well, it uses census data, number one, to tell us where the folks are on the ground. And then it can tell us what the noise impacts to each individual community are. It also takes into consideration, just like you said, aircraft speed, configuration, and the actual noise profiles of the individual types of aircraft. So we're going to be looking at all of that. We can look at, as a part of the baseline study and as a part of the modeling, the times of day that the aircraft fly, which runways. There can be an informal runway use program agreed to. Most of the reason that they do things the way they do is based on economics. Even down to the marketing piece where, if you say you want to leave at 8:01 in the morning, if somebody schedules a flight at 8:15, the 8:01 departure is going to get more hits. So all the airlines try to schedule their departures at 8:01, which means they're stacked up at the runway. You've been in airplanes, sitting there waiting for departure because everybody wants to go at the same time. And that's a marketing piece. And then that means you have what we refer to as pushes or rushes, where everybody wants to go at the same time. Everybody wants to come at the same time. That's kind of a marketing piece. That'll be a harder nut to crack because it's just, that's just, airline business. But yeah, we can take a look at all of it. All of this is fair game for discussion before we got here, after we got here in the community working group. This is all fair game.
Great, thank you. The next question is kind of plaintive. How many years do you think it's going to take to create any changes in the arrival noise?
Good question. If we had the solution ready to go today and gave it to the FAA, it would take at least 2 years, at least. Now, throw in throw in the COVID, throw in the time it's just going to take us to do the study and make the recommendations, and the discussion that we have between now and the time that we actually agree with something with the FAA going forward, you're pushing it out to 2.5 or 3.
Thank you for being
Minimum.
honest.
I'll say minimum.
Yep. Thank you for being honest. At least we're starting. Is there a time period during the 24-hour day when flights cannot operate? If so, is that enforced?
Jason?
No, and that's
There
preempted
is
by
a time period. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's based on federal regulation. That's not up to the airport. They can discourage or try to encourage nighttime quiet hours, and that's something that we'll look at and we may recommend to them, but they can't enforce that.
Okay. All right. This may be our last question here. Why isn't just reducing operations a solution? Airport construction projects reveal that DCA is moving away from a destination to more of a transfer or hub airport with more operations. Yeah. Who wants to take that?
So I could take that.
Yeah.
Basically, airports operate. Typical model for an airport is to meet the demand. So the airport staff would probably tell you that all they're trying to do is meet the regional demand. And from meetings or calls that we've had with them so far, we've actually been told that demand for flights to DCA has outgrown Dulles, as an example, even though it's a smaller airport. So, I mean, they could, encourage use of other airports if they chose to, but it seems the model right now is to just try to meet that growing demand. And so what we'll be doing as a team on this project is assuming that the level of operations will either remain consistent or continue to grow. How can we help you all? How can we help reduce that noise impact over time in spite of, a growth in flight operations? There's not a lot we can do to reduce that demand or that operational level.
Does anybody want to talk about the perimeter rule, however? Andrew, were you thinking about that?
No, you can
Yep,
answer that. I was going to make a separate comment related to that if you wanted.
Emily, Emily, do you want to comment on the perimeter rule, and then we'll go to Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, there's also the based on, I'm assuming you're talking about this, we used to call it the slot rule, but the perimeter rule and the slot rule, the same thing, which is just making sure that there's flights coming in and that they're going further so that there's access to DC. I mean, it is where our government is conducted, our federal government is conducted. So that is a big piece of DCA, and obviously the proximity to the Capitol, DCA's capacity as well.
So my understanding was there was at one point a rule where planes flying further than a certain distance couldn't leave out of DCA. They had to go to Dulles. And Dulles expanded, assuming they would be getting more traffic, and then Congress changed its mind.
Yeah, and I think that's been a push and pull as long as I've been doing this, and way before, in terms of, folks and local elected officials wanting to keep that perimeter rule the same or the slot rule the same, and then folks who want access from Western states wanting to expand it. And that's a congressional, that's just been at a congressional debate for a very long time.
It's politics. Yep. Andrew, over to you.
Yeah, just a quick comment based on a lot of conversations that I've had with constituents on this study. I think that the land use piece is really important, particularly for us in local government. We're stepping a little bit outside of our lane here and trying to take on roles that we don't traditionally take on with the federal government and the FAA, and working really hard to speak up and speak out for our communities in our various jurisdictions, but also recognizing the limitations of what we can and what we can't do through the working group and through this effort. But I think the critical thing that I'm really glad that the consultant is doing, based on the response from so many community members, is looking specifically at the land use patterns and the context of the communities. We in local government all the time through our land use authority make decisions on what is appropriate levels of noise, what are appropriate types of uses in certain areas. And this is really an extension of that. As you're looking at that, there's a certain understanding of what the noise is going to be in an urban area versus in a rural or suburban area. There's a certain, there's certain other noises that are happening that drown out that noise, and that context, I think, is really an important piece of this, and is part of what has been the challenge for all of us and for jurisdictions. Particularly, my district goes from Frederick County to the DC line all the way along the Potomac River. It has rural, suburban, and urban. We have all of that in a very close proximity in the context of the different types of communities within a fairly small area throughout the region, and particularly in the district that I represent, is really important. And the ability of the consultant, which we don't have this subject matter expertise, I think it highlights how important this is to be able to look at that census data and figure out what the context is to do the work that we generally do at the local level, but in a way that reflects the FAA and the airport's efforts, is going to be really critical to the work and to the recommendation moving forward.
Yeah, thank you. So we are basically out of time. There are a lot more questions. Emily, I'm assuming, can we get the questions up on the website and some answers at that, not instantly, but over time? Is that something you guys would do?
Yes, I believe that is the plan. Jim, correct me if I'm wrong, is to have, I mean, certainly those answered, but on the website, and compiling those thematically as well. So they will be answered.
Yeah, if you didn't get your question answered tonight, email them to that noise2020@arlingtonva.us. That's noise2020@arlingtonva.us. That is going to be kind of the catch-all email. The counties are going to collectively combine those questions into similar groupings, and then we will eventually put out a frequently asked questions page, so that when, if you didn't get your question answered tonight, we will attempt to address it there. And remember, we are going to have another feedback session coming up in the future, so you'll have another bite of the apple in February-ish.
And to check and see how things are going, the website, right?
Yes, ma'am.
dca.nowgen.net, right?
Yes, ma'am. dca.nowgen.net, correct.
Yep, and we will have, I think posted, we'll have the slides for tonight that you put on and the presentation, and I think this has all been recorded, so I think that will be there. So there you go. Additional questions too, send them into the noise2020@arlingtonva.us, and the questionnaire is going to be up soon for people to answer. We will try in Arlington, we've got a list of folks, and try to, when that survey is ready to, put a questionnaire is ready to push that out, so that we'll keep people informed. So really appreciate everybody kind of tuning in here. So Matt, Andrew, any kind of closing comments you'd like to make real quick? We got 3 minutes.
I can do much shorter than 3 minutes. A big thank you. I think that the presentation showed why we sought to work together to bring on expertise, and Jim and Jason and Emily really appreciate it. I do know that there will be a lot of additional questions. I think the time of day point, in addition to the land use point you made, Andrew, is important. And then it's just excellent that we have both the expertise and then engaging on procedures that matter to our residents, like the Holt B that you mentioned earlier, Jim. So just a big thank you, and also really to Montgomery County, because I do think the partnership will help us.
Great, thank you. Andrew, any final words?
Sure, just building off of that, thank you, Libby, for hosting this and for including us and Matt and the partnership that we have, the consultant. I'm not sure if this is the end of the beginning or the beginning of the end, but it's something, and it's progress, and we certainly wouldn't be here if not for the advocacy of community members. I think we're really carrying the ball forward here to a certain degree, but without the Quiet Skies Coalition on my side of the river, and so many advocates on your side of the river, and so many people across the region who have spoken up and spoken out on behalf of their neighbors, on behalf of their families, on behalf of their communities, to try to get to a solution that makes sense. And the status quo is not tenable for too many people in all of our communities, and hopefully with the expertise that we've now brought on, we can make the case for a solution that actually works for everybody in the region that's reasonable, that's appropriate, and that allows us to meet our needs and also maintain the quality of life that we're also lucky to have in the best region anywhere on earth.
Yep, I will second that. Thank you all so much. I want a shout out to Rich Roisman. You haven't seen, and there's a whole crew behind the scenes making this happen. Thank you, folks, for tuning in. We will work to get all the questions answered, more information. I think it's the beginning. I don't know if it's the beginning of I think it's the beginning of the end. Finally fixing this. Finally, we're going to get this done. It's going to take a while, but we have started. It's just wonderful. Thank you, Ken Hartman here too, and your team. And Andrew, it's been a real pleasure having you over here. Sarda, this is great. I really like this cooperation because it's really the only way we're going to get this done. Jim, Emily, Jason, thank you all so much. This has just been great. Matt, always a pleasure to have you here with me. And thank you all so much.
And I want to thank Aaron Kraut on my team as well, who's been involved in all of this and really is my eyes and ears and my brain on many of these issues. So thank you to Aaron.
Great. Anybody else we should thank? I think we're good. All right. We just want to thank everybody. Everybody, stay well, socially distance, face coverings when you're out. Be well. Thank you very much. We're off and running.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all.